the Wade Center's podcast.
The podcast of Wheaton College.
Welcome to the Wade Center podcast. Last time, David Downing and Aaron Hill and I introduced you to George MacDonald's 1958 novel, Phantastes, which has been incredibly influential in people's thinking once they discovered that this is the fantasy novel that ignited C.S. Lewis's journey to Christian faith. What we didn't have time to talk about last time is an incident where Anodes, the protagonist, goes to he's on this boat. We talked about that. And he lands on this island that has this huge palace. And there he discovers these marble figures on pedestals. And you can see the relevance to the earlier conversation where he releases this woman from marble and she becomes his ideal that he's chasing after. So literally he puts marble figures on pedestals. And today we still talk about how someone pedestalizes someone else, or, oh, he fell off my pedestal. And so it becomes...
Does that remind you at all of the...
how I think about you, David?
Yes. Excellent. Okay, well, I won't finish the question. I was going to say in The Magician's Nephew, when they see all the figurines of all the monarchs that are standing there.
Oh, yeah.
So I wonder
maybe.
if this whole image of this whole line of marble figures may have been an image that Lewis used in Magician's Nephew.
Interesting.
Huh.
What's fascinating about it, though, is in Phantastes, Anodes, he can't quite touch the figures or get close to them, which goes with the symbolism of when you idolize someone from afar, you're not really getting to the truth of them. Okay, so he can't really access these marble statues, but then he discovers a library where there are books that he can enter into and actually feel the stories, become part of the stories. And it's as though saying, this is the literature that can really change your lives, which is fascinating in light of C.S. Lewis, where this novel by MacDonald actually changed Lewis's life. It baptized his imagination. Okay, so the first story that Anodes enters into and tells as though he experienced it is about suddenly being in another planet and encountering what look like humans, but that are very different. And I couldn't help but think of C.S. Lewis's Ransom trilogy, where he encounters a green lady and a very different kind of humanoid species. But here on this planet, the narrator encounters women that don't have arms, but they have wings, whereas the men have arms, but no wings. And what's fascinating is that the women do not give birth to children. They find the children.
Yeah.
And adopt them.
And the men do all the dishes.
Well, that's kind of interesting. I was wondering, how do these women who don't have arms and only wings pick up these babies? And MacDonald kind of realized he was in a problem, and he comes to the end of the story and just says, well, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened to these people on the other planet. Any comments by either of you about these winged women and armed men who find their babies?
Well, I was just stepping back just a little bit. Right before he leads into this chapter, he's talking about finding these books and he that he can step into them. And I was just going to read a portion here. You know, when I read this the first time, it's, as we've said, the plot is so trippy that it's really hard to figure out what's happening from page to page. So when I got to chapter 12, it wasn't immediately clear to me that he didn't actually travel to a different planet where these women had wings and stuff. And so, because everything's so fantastical. So and there's talking trees and stuff. So it's like, okay, yeah, women have wings. So in chapter 11 at the very end, he's talking about reading these books and how he steps into them. And then he says, was it a history? I was the chief actor therein. And then he says, I suffered my own blame. I was glad in my own praise. With the fiction, it was the same. Mine was the whole story. For I took the place of the character who was most like myself, and his story was mine. And so it just seamlessly moves into that. And you get into the next chapter, and then all of a sudden he's talking about other planets and other women. And you're like, well, did he go there? Is this a real thing? And so it's that dreamlike quality that I think makes it hard to question what's happening until you're about halfway through this chapter. And then you start going, wait, what a second, they find the babies and what the babies are named after? And then apparently the babies, when they die, they're born here in the real world. And so it's just very hard to keep track of what's real and what's not real in the story.
Right.
And so to me, chapter 12 just kind of glossed over. And then the Cosmo one really kind of hits you differently.
But let me tell you what I think is interesting about this story.
Okay.
Because when the narrator, whom Anodes identifies with, tells these people on another planet that on where he comes from on Earth, and he doesn't explain it in the text, but makes it clear enough that these people on another planet are kind of appalled at how people on Earth have babies.
Yeah.
And the women that are listening to his stories kind of wrap their wings around themselves and are somewhat horrified. And I'm just wondering if MacDonald was dealing with the fact that his wife had 11 babies. Of course, she had only had about 5 or 6 by the time he wrote this novel. But he probably saw the suffering of childbirth and imagined what would it be like if you could just find babies. And the reason I think he thought a lot about that is he does the exact same thing almost 40 years later, after his wife has had her 11 babies, and several of which die, but they live to adolescence, if not young adulthood. But still, George MacDonald and his wife, Louisa, outlived 4 of their children.
Wow.
And he puts the same idea into Lilith in the 1890s, where this group of children just find babies out in the countryside, and they're kind of shocked when other people question where these babies come from. Well, they just grow.
Huh.
So
it's like an Easter egg hunt.
It's like
it's
like the stork that shows up almost.
Yeah.
Right.
You know, it's that kind of that motif. Yeah.
right.
Well, part of the fall is pain in childbirth, so maybe he's thinking of another world where they're unfolding.
There
There's
isn't
no
a
pain.
fall.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
Huh.
Yeah. In 1854, which is when MacDonald's wife gave birth to their 3rd child, Charlotte Bronte actually got severe. She had just been married the year before and had, I think it was the 1850s. I could be wrong about the exact date, but she had such severe morning sickness that she actually died of morning sickness. That's how Charlotte Bronte died.
Wow.
So while Louisa is having children, I mean, just the difficulty of childbirth in the 19th century.
Well, so I was going to ask you guys about 2 things with this story. It feels very Victorian to me. So the first thing that stood out to me is at the beginning of the chapter, he sets the story up by talking about the very first line. He says, "They who believe in the influences of the stars over the fates of men are in feeling at least nearer the truth than they who regard the heavenly bodies as related to them merely by a common obedience to an external law." And he talks about how essentially no shining belt or gleaming moon, no red or green glory in a self-encircling twin star, but has a relation with the hidden things of a man's soul. And so there's this idea that the stars have a relationship to not just human beings, but are intertwined with our fates somehow, which is not a thing that we believe anymore. And Lewis touches on that a lot with the sort of views, sort of very medieval view of the cosmos and of the planets, and there's actual angels that rule over the planets. And in the Chronicles of Narnia, the stars are actually angels, right? They're actually like living beings. They're not just these
Right.
dead balls of gas. So that to me felt very Victorian. But then there's a lot of talk about death in here. And I just wanted to read the first time that he talks about death in here, he says, this one maiden dies. He says, a great light shone in the eyes of one maiden who turned and walked slowly away with her purple and white wings half dispread behind her. She was found the next morning dead beneath a withered tree on a bare hillside some miles inland. They buried her where she lay. And then he goes on, he says, the sign or cause of coming death is an indescribable longing for something. They know not what, which seizes them and drives them into solitude, consuming them within till the body fails. And then he goes on, he says, they essentially die of their desire in solitary places, but it seems to me that thereafter they are born babes upon earth, where, if when grown they find each other, it goes well with them. If not, it will seem to go ill, but of this I know nothing. So there's just this discussion of death, and they have these like very solemn, honorable deaths, but they die of desire in this other world. It's very strange to me, and it's very dreamlike. But it seems like death was and if the childbirth thing is a theme here, that would make sense because a lot of babies died in childbirth and mothers died in childbirth. Right. And it was the idea of having children, I think, in our modern society, death is not as associated with it as it would have been back then. Right. So the idea that a pregnancy might bring with it bad things.
Yeah. The thing is, none of his children died as babies, or I think what Lewis especially glommed onto is this idea of an indescribable longing for something they know not what. And when Lewis read this as a 17-year-old, he goes, oh, George MacDonald understands that indescribable longing, but you don't know what it is for. And MacDonald, though, knew that the indescribable longing is met at death, because that's when we will be welcomed to the God who is love.
Yeah.
So I think that is more what MacDonald was thinking about, but that's why it baptized the imagination of C.S. Lewis. So I think this story definitely did have an impact on Lewis, even though as a story in and of itself, it's not resolved well.
Yeah.
Part of it is in verse.
Yeah, the poem that he writes, he kind of lost me when he got to the poem.
Right. But the next chapter that follows it is a complete story, a wonderful story unto itself. In fact, David, you once told me that this was your favorite part of Phantastes, is this book that Anodes reads in the library about the student of Prague, Cosmos. And why is
Cosmo.
that? Yeah, Cosmos, excuse me.
It's my favorite part of Phantastes, and it's almost my favorite part of MacDonald.
Really?
Because he often is too self-indulgent with images and plot devices, and I would say repetitive. Henry James called Victorian novels loose, baggy monsters. And he really wanted more structure to a novel.
Yeah.
And I think this story is the most economical and efficient that you'll find in MacDonald.
It's almost like a short story.
It
really.
is. It's almost like a short story, and he did that a lot in Adela Cathcart. She's sick and depressed, and people come and tell her stories. So he likes the idea of a story within a story. He does it 3 times in the Portent. He says, I was out in Scotland, and I ran into this guy who started telling me the story.
Yeah.
And he was telling me about a story about a guy who told a story. And I go, no, George, just tell your story and then move on with the next story.
Yeah.
Right.
But this one is very economical, and the imagery and the characterizations are very well developed.
Well, one of the stories in Adela Cathcart, which was written about 5 or 6 years after Phantastes, is reproduced as a short story unto itself, The Light Princess.
Right.
And so you can buy The Light Princess by itself, but it's just one of the short stories. And basically all these people are telling stories in Adela Cathcart to cheer up Adela, who is in a type of depression. And MacDonald himself went through a depression in his late adolescence, maybe early 20s, while he was in college. So when many students go through a depression.
Okay, so another story that he reads, the protagonist is named Cosmo von Wehrstahl, which means war steel. It means armor. And it's interesting because Cosmo's very good with fighting, and he
is an expert in armor.
Yeah. So he's got a good name. So he's got a lot of scientific and literary curiosity, but he lives alone in a high room and has very few visitors. A friend asked him to go to an antique store or a curio shop or just a place that sells peculiar items.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And he's entranced by this mirror, and he must have this mirror. And so he says, how much for the mirror? And the guy names the price, which is way beyond him. And he says, well, you seem like the kind of person who should own this. I think I knew your father. He's of noble background, even though he's a poor student. And so he takes the mirror, but as he's leaving, the shop owner says, this is the 6th time I've sold that mirror. I wonder how it'll go this time. Yeah. And he makes Cosmo promise, if you ever want to resell the mirror, you have to sell it back to me.
Yeah.
Which is I think I like that sense of foreboding. It reminds me a lot of an Edgar Allan Poe story. It's kind of got that exotic atmosphere. Mm. So he takes the mirror home to his garret and polishes it off and hangs it up over the hearth. But when he looks in the mirror, there's a beautiful woman sitting on his divan or the couch there. And he says, wow. And he turns around and there's no one in the room. He can only see this beautiful woman in the mirror image. So he watches her but then she disappears eventually. He can never see her in the room, only in the mirror image. And he falls in love with her and feels that I must meet this woman in real life. So he goes to all these parties and places trying to find somewhere he can actually meet her. Did she ever have a name?
Yeah, she has a name.
At the end, we find out her name was Hohenweiss. That's right, which means high white. So he eventually finds out that a woman has been put under an enchantment, and nobody quite knows what that means. But obviously the curse was that she lives in mirror reality, not in real reality. And he actually gets to talk to her in the mirror, and he declares his love for her. And she says, well, please break the mirror and set me free. And he says, well, if I break the mirror, I may not ever see you again. She says, well, yeah, that might happen. And so he has this great dilemma. Shall he obey her wish and break the mirror, or find some other way to meet her? So eventually, and we talked last week about Anodes and renunciation. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you can't possess something. You can only look at it. So eventually he figures out what's going on, that she's under this curse, and she's a beautiful princess who has to live in this mirror world. So she figures out where he lives. She and her maid go rushing over to his house to find out what's going on with the mirror.
So it shows she does live outside the mirror.
Yeah, she does. She's trapped to it to where she has to enter it for, I think, a time or something.
Oh, okay, okay.
Right?
So
in terms of relationships with men,
yeah,
I
and
guess.
she's a slave to whichever man owns the mirror.
Right.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I missed that detail. But at the end of the story, she goes to meet him, and he comes stumbling out. He's broken the mirror, but he's injured himself, and so he bleeds to death. But now she's freed from the curse. Is that a decent summary?
Yeah.
I forgot about her being slave to because she's like almost like Sleeping Beauty. Doesn't she just lie somewhere in the real world? She's under a spell.
Yeah, it's the
way that trippy, to use Aaron's term. Yeah, it is trippy.
The way that it's strange, because like she finally comes, finds him, and then it's like he did not reply. His hand was pressed against his side. She looked more closely. The blood was welling from between the fingers. She flung her arms around him with a faint, bitter wail. When Lisa, who's her attendant, comes up, she found her mistress kneeling above a wan, dead face, which smiled on in the spectral moonbeams. And then the story ends, and you're like, wait, what? What just happened? Yeah, there's also an element of the occult here. When he starts off, he's talking about his room, and it says, curious instruments were heaped in the corners, and in one stood a skeleton, half leaning against the wall and half supported by a string about its neck. And he's holding a sword, and then there's a large dried bat with wings dispread, the skin of a porcupine, and a stuffed sea mouse. And so it's just this very strange, like odd, kind of creepy, almost horror movie kind of a setting. And then to get her out of the mirror, he draws like a circle on the floor.
Right.
Oh, that's right.
Which is
this
a very
whole occult ceremony.
Yeah, like a Dr. Faustus.
Yeah, and there's like a boiling pot with ingredients that he has to put in.
Of newt and all that kind of thing. Yeah, it sounds like the Macbeth witches.
Yeah, it's very strange.
Right. And he thinks magical incantations will get him what he wants.
Yeah.
And so David is exactly right. This story becomes a synecdoche for the entire novel. And a synecdoche, of course, is a term that means a part that represents the whole.
Right.
So when I read this copy, the owner of Phantastes before me, who is a guy named David Downing, who happens to be sitting next to me, actually wrote in the margins, need love versus gift love, which is something we discussed last time. And he wrote it after the woman rose to her feet and says, because at first he couldn't get up the energy to break the mirror because that's the only way he knew how to see her. She says, he loves me not even as I love him. And alas, I care more for his love than even for the freedom I ask. So caring more for the other than for the self.
Yeah.
She wants what he wants rather than what she wants. And that's what Anodes has to learn throughout this text, as we talked about last time.
Yeah, Cosmo is kind of a stand-in for Anodes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which then goes back to what he says about books, that he identifies with the protagonist of the books.
Yeah, it's almost as if he's Cosmo in the story when he's reading it. I just wanted to read a couple quotes that kind of set up the
first. Before you read those quotes, to reinforce what you're saying, he is like Cosmo, and MacDonald feels like Cosmo. He actually writes another book called Warlock, O Glen Warlock, where the protagonist is called Cosmo.
Oh, wow.
Who has pretty much the same background as George MacDonald. So for some reason, he identifies with characters named Cosmo. I don't know why.
Gotcha.
But now go ahead and do your reading.
Well, I was also going to say, when we were talking about the poverty angle, I mean, MacDonald was known for struggling with poverty his whole life. And so the fact that he makes the character sort of struggling with poverty in the story, to me, it felt, again, sort of like an autobiographical thing that MacDonald puts in. But when he's talking about the mirror, he talks about how he becomes so obsessed with her that everything in the real world starts to take on this otherworldly sense. And he says his engagements were neglected. He cared for nothing. The sky with the great sun in it was to him a heartless, burning desert. And then he talks about the men and the women in the streets were mere puppets. He saw them all on an ever-changing field of a camera obscura, as if he's watching them as a reflection on a wall inside a dark room. And then he says, she alone and altogether was his universe, his well of life, his incarnate good.
Yes.
And then he goes on to say, when he actually does the ceremony,
even though he's never met her, this pedestalizing from afar.
Well, but then for him, it becomes this obsession with not just her, but possessing her. He wants her, not her good. And then when he does the ceremony, he says, and on the seventh evening. So it's very much like a creation story. He's kind of echoing here. From that on, which she last appeared, he found himself prepared for the exercise of unlawful and tyrannical power. So he's very much setting up this idea that he's doing this because he's determined that this is the only way he'll ever be happy, is if he can have her. And so he's willing to violate sort of laws, of spiritual laws even, to get her, so that when she finally shows up and then her words, she says to him, I am a slave while that mirror exists. And he almost can't bring himself to do it. And she pleads with him. She says, Cosmo, if thou lovest me, set me free, even from thyself. Break the mirror.
And the symbolism of that, especially in the 19th century, but I still think it's true today. I mean, what you were just talking about, Aaron, there are still people who obsess over a person from afar and just think, I will not be happy with life until I have them. And this is kind of tied into what Lewis writes about in Surprised by Joy, right? This indescribable longing people associate it with, well, if I could just have that person, if I could, sexually unite with them, that will satisfy this longing. And it doesn't. But the mirror, especially, still today, but in the 19th century, women were primarily defined by how they looked. They are imprisoned by a mirror.
And their prospects in life were tied to who decided to marry them, over which they had very little control.
Yeah, that's right. And of course, the richer you were, the better you could look because you could afford finery.
Yeah.
Well, I just love the image of the mirror world. Once again, like the whole story of Phantastes, he finds his father's big desk, and that's where the fairy comes from. So it's a portal into fairyland.
Right.
But once again, a piece of furniture, this magical mirror, is a portal to mirror reality. Chesterton said
Except
if you want
it's not a portal. In Lilith, it is a portal that the primary character goes through a mirror to fairyland. But what is aggravating to Cosmo is he can't go through the mirror to get to her.
And she can't see him. That's the other weird thing in this story, where he can only see her if her back is turned to the mirror or something. Somehow they can't see each other's eyes in the mirror. It doesn't make sense when he explains it. But the idea is that they can only see each other's backs, so they can never look eye to eye. And so it kind of builds the desire for him to actually see her face to face.
Well, there's an important line that says his passion ripened, or I should say withered.
Yes, that is so important.
This goes back to almost the four loves. Charles Williams, Lewis's friend, had a whole tradition of romantic theology, or whole theory of romantic theology. And he says falling in love is often, for many people, it's the first time you get out of yourself. You come fascinated with someone else. You want their well-being. You want them to love you. Now, I think Williams took it too far. Lewis was wiser in Four Loves when he said if you treat any of the loves as an angel, it'll turn into a demon. And romantic love can very quickly, I mean, that's where stalkers come from.
Yeah.
Right,
They think they're absorbed with this person, but it's a very unhealthy kind of thing.
Yeah.
And often it's dangerous to the object of love.
Well, you can see how far gone Cosmo is when he's having this conversation. She's begging him to set her free. He says, MacDonald writes, a fierce struggle arose in Cosmo's bosom. Now she was in his power. And then he says, to break the mirror would be to destroy his very life, to banish out of his universe the only glory it possessed. And then this is the line, I underlined this in my book. He said, the whole world would be but a prison if he annihilated the one window that looked into the paradise of love. Not yet pure in love, he hesitated. So he's setting up, he's saying, if I destroy this mirror, then my world, I'll be trapped in this sort of prison where I'll never be able to love someone again. And so he's convinced himself it would be better for him to possess her and have her than to have sort of this true love that would never exist. And so he says, his love wasn't yet pure.
Right.
So he tries, and the interesting thing is he tries to destroy the mirror, but there's some sort of thunder or boom.
Right. Let me go back, though, to build on what you just said. He also, MacDonald describes this woman in the mirror that, as you say, Cosmo wants to possess and can't. And so he starts using occult practices. MacDonald describes her, she was a form more like marble than a living woman. So that ties it back to the whole, and again, makes this a synecdoche of the whole novel, because Anodes himself
the marble lady.
has identified a marble lady.
Yeah.
But you could take it in a lot of ways. This mirror, it could be the world of imagination. We have our real world, but then we could look in a similar world in imagination.
Yes.
But she could represent art or beauty that you could never directly possess art or beauty, but you can kind of see an image of it. So it's very rich symbolism. Things like women who have wings rather than arms. I don't know what to make of that.
Yeah.
But the woman who only appears in the mirror, to me, that's a very rich symbol.
Earlier in the text, before these stories we're talking about that Anodes discovers in the library, Anodes is writing, all mirrors are magic mirrors. The commonest room is a room in a poem when I turn to the glass. So that reinforces what you just said, David, that the mirror becomes an image of imagination. But the trouble is then your imagination turns this object into something that you imagine you will be happy only if you possess it. So this is what makes the Cosmos story so brilliant. It has these connections to the other parts of the novel.
And he goes on after that comment about the mirror to say, and I underline this because to me this stood out about the theme of nature that runs through the story. He says, nature in some degree as she really is. Again, nature is personified as a woman here. And as she represents herself to the eye of the child whose everyday life, fearless and unambitious, meets the true import of the wonder-teeming world around him and rejoices therein without questioning. Again, there's this romantic idea that there's some sort of relationship with nature that can give you a window into the truth.
It's, once again, sweet desire, that indescribable longing that nature can give you, that a woman can give you.
But one of the things that stood out to me from this story, and I think he sets it up with the other story about the women with wings and finding the babies, and then they die and they're born in the real world.
Or our world.
Our world. Yeah, sorry. I think he kind of sets it up with this where the way he dies at the end, I was left going, oh, well, he died, but maybe he was born in some other place, right? Because he kind of sets you up for that with the story before it, where when the people die in that world, they're not just gone forever. It's not a materialistic world where when you die, you just dissolve into nothingness. They're sort of born into our reality.
You know where he was reborn? There's 3 different film versions of a film called The Student from Prague.
The Student of Prague.
Student of Prague, and he buys this magic mirror, but it has different magical qualities. But I can't believe that whoever wrote that screenplay hadn't read the Cosmo story.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and I've done research trying to find a connection, and I haven't been able to find it because The Student of Prague is one of the only movies that Dorothy Sayers mentions in her Lord Peter Wimsey stories. And we were talking earlier about Attila Cathcart. One of the stories in Attila Cathcart is about a student of Prague, but what he gets obsessed with is a woman that he wants to possess named Lilith.
Oh, my goodness.
And rather than a mirror, what occurs in that story is this woman keeps getting painted in paintings but by her father, but he paints her in kind of very cruel, demonic ways. And so this young man becomes a painter to try to free the woman from her painting. So MacDonald was definitely obsessed with this
image,
idea.
yeah.
And once again, Attila Cathcart was just 5 or 6 years after Phantastes.
But what I was going to say is when Cosmo dies in her arms, and then she's been freed from the mirror by him, and it just ends abruptly, and he doesn't say anything more about it. Going back and listening back to our episode last week and the discussion we had, and how Anodes himself dies at the end, and then wakes up in the real world.
Yes, it's a synecdoche.
To me, there's this implication that Cosmo isn't really dead there. He's been reborn someplace else. And the thing that stood out to me was...
Don't say as a Seinfeld character.
No.
He was reborn in New York.
No, I was going to say, try and say something more profound. No, I can see how this would have baptized Lewis's imagination with this idea that death is not the end. There must be something beyond death. And the only, as you said, the only time that this deep desire, this Sehnsucht within us will be satisfied is when we enter into communion with our Creator. And so there's this, it sort of evokes this desire within you to go, oh, well, maybe that's when I'll finally be satisfied, as opposed to thinking, well, this job is going to satisfy, or this person is going to satisfy, or if I live in this one place near these specific people, that will satisfy the deepest desires. And so we
visit
spend
this nature, beautiful nature. Yeah,
we spend our entire life thinking this is the thing that's going to make me happy, and then it doesn't, and then and sometimes that turns people and it makes them cruel, and they become obsessed with possessing something, and they don't actually care about the good of creation itself or the good of a spouse themselves. And so I don't know. That's kind of the thing that stood out to me in this Cosmo story, and it helped me make sense of the book as a whole, I think. At least that's what I took away from it.
Yeah, you can see more influence on Lewis in his early poem, Dimer, that he wrote before he became a Christian. But that also has a palace with all these robes and things.
Yeah.
And at the very end, Dimer says, I know that good is coming. And it's almost an exact quote from the ending of of Phantastes.
Yeah.
Wow.
Some people claim that this motif comes from William Wilson by Edgar Allan Poe. He has this roguish nobleman who has a double who keeps following him. Rather than being an evil double, this double is actually his conscience. He's trying to cheat at cards, and this more or less twin brother shows up and says, I don't think you can do that. That's not... And then he tries to seduce a woman, and his brother shows up and says, I don't think that's... And then at the end, he gets so frustrated by his double, his good double, not his evil double, showing up, that he tries to stab him in the mirror, and he ends up stabbing himself and dying.
Oh, Wow.
That influenced more the Student of Prague films than this Cosmo story.
Yeah, well, I think somewhere in Wikipedia or somewhere it says that Phantastes was influenced by William Wilson, but I don't see the
I don't
connection.
see it. Yeah.
Right. Well, to me it's fascinating. I think I would say Lewis does this better than MacDonald in some ways, but when you read Phantastes, I see where Lewis got some of that inspiration. But that we talk about Sehnsucht, and I think one of the things that those stories and the Chronicles of Narnia, and then also maybe Paralandra do, is it takes away the fear of death,
right?
In a way that is a positive. Growing up in the church, one of the witnessing techniques was, if you were to die tonight,
right?
And it's very much this idea of like, you could die in a car crash, especially like at Halloween. There were all these movies that we would get played in the youth group. I remember this one where these kids get in this horrible car accident, and then they, go before God, and they can't get into heaven, and so they have to kind of go to this. It was like a scary kind of Halloween type conversion thing, and there was just this fear associated with death of like, what's on the other side. You're afraid of it, but then when you read these stories, you go, oh well, maybe I shouldn't be afraid of it, but only if I'm rightly related, if my love is pure for the right thing. So
sacrificial death, once again modeled by Jesus. And I thought there was something kind of interesting that Cosmo at the end of this story is holding his side with blood coming through as though he was pierced in the side. And who does that remind us of?
Did we mention his name? Cosmo means the world or beauty or order. It's a very rich...
that's why I mistakenly said cosmos. That's why
cosmos.
We call it...
Our word cosmetics comes from that root. A funny story by Woody Allen called the Kugelmass episode, where this Jewish guy invents a machine where if you jump into it with a novel and then flip the switch, you go into the world of the novel.
Oh, wow.
You were talking earlier about how you, as a reader, you enter the world of the novel, the world of imagination.
Yeah.
Only in Woody Allen's version, he goes into Madame Bovary, and it turns out she has really expensive taste, and she comes to New York, and she wants to go to all the expensive restaurants.
Yeah.
So he tries to send her back into the novel, and he accidentally gets into the machine with a Spanish textbook. So at the end of that story, he's being chased across the hillside by irregular verbs.
Yeah, he's pretty brilliant.
Yeah. Well, it was enjoyable for me to talk to you guys about Phantastes, because every other time I've read it, it's been it's a very strange story, and it's hard to make sense of. But I think it's good to talk about it with other people, because as you've said, David, you read the Cosmo story, you kind of go away thinking like, well, what just happened? Why didn't they have... It's interesting. We're used to happy endings so much that we get disappointed when we don't have happy endings. And the story itself is full of all these stories
but
that don't really
have
resolve.
a happy ending. There is a smile on his face. He knows that he has finally reached gift love rather than need love.
Well, people want to know how to get more out of these books. I was struggling with Phantastes, and then I listened to our podcast last week, and I said, "Oh, that makes a lot of sense now." So, I got more out of the podcast than our listeners did. Once you put it all together and edited it, and then had all those really pithy quotes.
Oh, thank you.
I said, "Oh, now I'm sort of getting the gist of Phantastes."
So, fans, let us know via email to the Wade or to YouTube whether our discussions of Phantastes have helped you.
I want to forget one that says, "I thought I understood Phantastes, but after listening to you guys, I'm totally confused." We may get one of those too.
Yeah.
Okay. Goodbye, y'all.
Yeah. See you guys.
The Wade Center podcast is a production of the Marion E. Wade Center at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. Our hosts are the co-directors of the Wade Center, Drs. Crystal and David C. Downing. Our episodes are produced and edited by Aaron M. Hill. If you enjoy the podcast and the content we offer, please leave us a review on iTunes, tell your friends, and consider making a donation to the Wade. The Wade Center is entirely self-funded. Financial gifts help support the expert services, vast collections, and varied programming we offer at no cost. If you have questions about the podcast or suggestions for future episodes, please email us at wade@wheaton.edu or contact us via Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. To learn more about the Wade Center, our 7 British Christian authors, what we offer, and how to make a donation, visit our website at wheaton.edu/Wade.